Welcome, everybody, to Season 1, Episode 2 of Fill the Glass. This session is being recorded. I think you were probably warned about that on your way in. I'm Cary Millsap. What I would like to talk about today is yesterday. I had a really busy day yesterday because, let me change slides and show you. I've been working on this. So it's the book I showed you the proof of last week, and I've been working really hard on trying to get this thing wrapped up. So I was spending some time once I figured out, okay, there's not going to be any 23C data in the book, and it really doesn't matter because it's not that earth-shaking what was going to be there. But I got re-engineering the very first chapter of the book, and I can, I'll tell you, I don't think you need a picture of it, but if I need a picture, I'll go grab it. Basically, chapter 1 is a hello world chapter. Here, I can show you really live. Chapter 1 says, if you've never seen a trace file before, well, today's your day. And there's this much text about how you can generate your very first trace file. Now, if you were here last week, you know that there's a GitHub repository that's associated with the book. And I thought, hey, you know what? The hello world from chapter 1 needs to be a script. I'm going to go ahead and minimize this now and start showing you some things. It needs to be a script in GitHub. So that's literally exactly what I did. I created in my GitHub repository, let me park this here so we can see more things at once. The GitHub repository has a hello world.sql in it. And if I open it up, of course, it's going to go to another screen. If I open it up, here's what it looks like. The first line is a comment of a peculiar format because I've got an inventory.sh script that I know this is small for all of you, so let me pop it up a little bit. But when I run the inventory script, it basically greps off the top line or heads off the top line of the script. So you can see I've got 23 scripts now in my GitHub repository. And the one called Hello World does this. It runs a script called trace on. You can imagine what that does. In fact, you don't have to imagine. I'll show you what trace on does. It's very simple. It's a little more complicated maybe than you thought, but it's still fairly simple. It sets max dump file size to unlimited. It sets statistic level equal to typical, and then it runs dbms session.session trace enable. Trace off does pretty much the same thing, only runs the session trace disable. So hello world turns trace on, selects hello world from dual, turns trace off, and then it prints the name of the trace file, which is what this my trace file script does. If you want to see what it looks like, you can look it up on GitHub, or you can see here, it's just a select from $diag info. And then the last thing is to spool out the trace content. And the trace content script is a little more interesting. Not much, but a little, because it's like a 6-line SQL statement. No big deal. It's just basically querying from $diag trace file contents. So my goal is that somebody can get into SQL Plus, and with SQL path set to the directory where these scripts are, they can type in hello world, run that, and get literally baby's first trace file. So literally what I've done here is just run this script through SQL Developer, and you can actually see here's the trace data for my little hello world experience. If I widen it a little bit, you'll be able to see select hello world from dual. There it is. Of course, it's also in a file, and that file is called, it's the first line of the trace file, of the trace output actually. Or you remember there was this my trace file script that I ran, and this is the output of that. So we could go to the file system and grab the file, but I thought for hello world, it'd be nice just to show what a trace file looks like. And here's your very first trace file. Ta-da. All you have to do is type out hello world. So I thought, well, that's fantastic. And then I went off and I did the same thing for ADB. When you're in the autonomous world, you don't have as many privileges as you do in the non-autonomous world, but I have an ADB directory that has its own hello world, and it is a little simpler than the other one, but it runs an ADB trace on, which is just an alter session, set SQL trace equal true, and then an ADB trace off, which sets SQL trace to false, and then an ADB my trace content, which queries a view called session cloud trace, I believe. But I don't have to guess, I can look it up. So let's look at my trace content.sql, and there it is. Select trace from session cloud trace ordered by row number. So I've got all these things. I'm very happy. I've got hello world working. By the way, it also works in the ADB world. So I @ADB/hello world, and ta-da, it selected hello world from dual, and then it traced it. And my trace data is identifiable. Pretty sure there's a hello world in here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. Hello world from dual got traced. So even on ADB, we can trace. Only at level 1, as it turns out, which is not optimal, but at least we can trace. So I'm very happy with myself at this point. And I start to realize, I don't know when it dawned on me, but at some point it dawned on me that I am always a privileged user in the databases that I run my tests in. You see where this is coming. I saw the look on Martin's face when I said that. So what happens is I will just say things at a conference like, oh, just select from $diag, blah, blah, blah. Because I can do that at home, because I'm God Almighty in my own autonomous database, and I'm God Almighty in my own little 19.3 database that I've run in VirtualBox on my laptop. But just because I say select from $blah, blah, blah, doesn't mean that the people who are listening can actually do a select from $blah, blah, blah. So I started looking into that, and I started kind of messing around with creating a user from scratch. And I want to show you a little bit about what's going on. Really, my goal today is to drive you into this GitHub repository. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a guided tour. So you know what Hello World does. I'm going to go ahead and close that window. Here's the one from 19.3. So this is the non-ADB Hello World. But I started messing around with what permissions would I want a developer to have. So I created this file called dev_trace_permissions.sql. And it's not meant to be a script that you run full on, but you can't. Actually, I lied. It is a script that I expect you and want you to run full on. And if I change out hello world with dev, what do I call it? Trace permissions. Basically, it's a little test, which is going to connect. And by the way, don't tell anybody, but my password is Oracle. It's going to connect as Oracle. It's going to drop a user called dev1 in case there's one already there. Then it's going to grant connect to it. It's going to grant create session to it. And then these are the things that dev1 has to have in order to see its own trace data, for example. Let me pop the magnification of this up a little bit so it's easier to see. But these are the grants that need to happen in order for dev1 to be able to run things like my trace tier, my trace file, and my trace content. So all I'm doing is granting what I think are the minimal permissions required to make dev1, the dev1 user, able to query these things. And when I run this, let me erase my script output. When I run this, I should get nothing but clean drop, succeeded. There are a couple of describes here. Describe of $diag info, diag trace file, and diag trace file contents. And those describes all worked. Here they are. There, and there. And then I actually run trace on, which again, that uses dbms session trace enable. So I have to have some permissions to be able to do that. And you can actually see the granting of execute on sys.dbms session up here. There's also, and it's explained in the book, but there's also a necessary, but I hate it. Those of you who followed the Slack technical channel yesterday saw Doug and me having a conversation about this, but I hate that I actually have to grant alter session to a developer in order for them to use dbms session trace enable. I think it's kind of a dumb idea that you have to have access to the very highly powerful alter session privilege just to run something that uses alter session. My argument in the debate yesterday was that had dbms session been an auth ID definer, we wouldn't need to grant this powerful privilege to developers. So at any rate, this is all the stuff, and it's not that much. It seemed like I should have needed a grant read on diag info, but as it turns out, You don't need that in order for this to work. So I commented it out. But this is basically the minimal set of privileges, to the best of my being able to come up with it yesterday, for a developer. And as I showed you, when I run it, it runs just fine. I can actually grab my trace data and everything's cool. There's also a script for the DBA called DBA trace permissions, and it's very similar to the one for developers. If I pop the magnifications, you'll be able to see the symmetry. So instead of, for a DBA, instead of getting DBMS application info privilege, the DBA gets DBMS monitor privilege. Everything else is pretty much the same, symmetrical. Here's the thing that I learned yesterday, and I still don't know. I've got to look it up. But when I tried to grant read or select on these $diag trace file and $diag trace file contents views, I didn't have permission, even as sysdba, to grant select on these things or read on these things until I put the underscore in. And I'm not a good enough DBA to know why exactly.
There are synonyms and you cannot grant on synonyms.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So these are the underlying base tables beneath the synonyms that I need to grant permissions on. Now, another thing that was interesting that I learned a couple of days ago from the Oracle, it was an Oracle ACE Slack channel that I'm a member of, is that there's a difference between granting read and granting select. I had never seen a grant read before, and apparently it's new in 12.1. And whereas grant select will allow you to do a select for update, which can actually lock a table, grant read doesn't allow somebody to lock a table. So I was stuck for a little while because in the autonomous world, so the ADB version of these things are right here. So here's the ADB dev trace permissions. And what I kept trying to do was grant select on session cloud trace to dev1, but Oracle wouldn't let me, even as admin. And I thought, come on, man, I'm king of the universe when I'm admin. Of course I have permission to grant select on a table. And a gentleman from Cambridge actually told me in Slack, hey, you need to grant read, not select. I'm like, what? The SQL language, I guess this is not technically SQL, but the language that you use to speak to Oracle just keeps growing and growing and growing. All these new keywords come up, and I didn't see that one. So anyway, I learned that this week as well. I have consumed 15 minutes. I do notice that Gumi's on board now, and I wanted to ask him a question. Before I start closing windows down and get to Gumi, does anybody have a question about what you're seeing so far? And I see that the chat's got stuff on it. So let me actually open that because I haven't looked at it yet. So let's see what we've got here. Okay, yeah, Martin's shared the USL URL. John asked, what was the password for the original Scott account and to what it was referring? And it's Scott's cat named Tiger. And yep, there you go. Nancy knows. I think that's it for the talking for a second. Does anybody have any questions about what you're seeing, about what's going on with GitHub repository? The URL is here. It's github.com/CaryMillsap/tracing-oracle. And there's loads of stuff, and it's changing daily. It'll stabilize probably this week. And I think the book's about ready to go at this point. I've got just about all the research that I thought I was going to need to do done. And since I've decided I'm not going to include 23C data, I think actually I'm just one proofread away from being done. Gumi, I mentioned your name a little while ago before you joined up, but I would like you to unmute, and I'd like to talk to you for a second in front of these nice folks. How are you today?
Okay. I'm doing fine, and yourself?
I'm fine as well. About the same as yesterday when we last talked.
Gradual change.
Yes, indeed.
Okay.
It's a 1% every day plan I'm on. I'm trying to get 1% better every day. Now, I wanted to ask you, you were the first reviewer of the Tracing Oracle book, and you were also the person who's probably reviewed it the largest number of times. And I think Nancy comes in second. She might actually be right at your heels. You may have actually both read it about the same number of times, which is a lot. And I guess I have one more for you, but I just wanted to ask you in front of God and everybody here today, what that experience was like, what, if you can remember back to the first time you saw it, what you thought about it. Just kind of wanted to get your perspective in front of folks as to what you think about the Tracing Oracle book and who it's for and what it is and how it struck you.
Okay. First of all, I liked the length, or the lack of length of it. It's really short. Not because it's boring or unimportant, but I've read all of your other books, and I think I've actually proofread all of them. So what I thought is, here I have, in a concise format, an update of what I thought I already knew. For example, the one that you have on the screen now with the blue heading. It's fairly long, about 300 pages, I think, and it's it's the thing, yeah, if you want to learn everything about tracing. But I did not want to have to reread 300 pages to understand, is there something new for me there? But, you know, it's in that red one, and anyone who might be interested in tracing without even knowing it, because they need it, they might go from the red book to the blue one. So I thought this is a perfect, like a summary of 25 or 30 years of experience that will also be a platform into something bigger.
The funny thing is that when this started, I was actually sending, and by comparison, this is the other book. So we're talking about a big difference in size. I was actually sending, when we get a new customer, I'd send them this and I would say, hey, you guys need to read pages 73 and 74, 50 and 51, 17, and 108. And it would take me a long time to figure out which pages to point people to. And it just kind of, one day I said to Jeff, I said, we need a book that just tells people the basics of how to get tracing turned on. And Jeff looked me in the eye and he says, it's not a book, that's a pamphlet. I said, well, I think it's going to be about 30 pages. And he said, no, it's not going to be 30 pages. It's going to be about 3 pages. And so I kind of had in mind that I was going to go take the big blue book, this guy here, and just copy and paste from it the things that we need most often in the right order. And so when I did that, it was about a 35-page book. And then when I proofread that before giving it to anybody, it occurred to me that this 35-page book asks a lot of questions that it itself doesn't answer. I thought, well, that's not very good. That's just dirty. So I filled in the bits that weren't in the blue book. And before I knew it, there were lots of things in the red book that weren't in the blue book at all. So not only is it a little better organized, but there's actually a bunch of new stuff. Like, for example, these privileges that I foolishly hadn't been really considering over the past several years, but it takes a day or two to figure out. And so when you try to convince somebody to trace, if permissions is an impediment, then you might lose somebody who might have been willing to trace if it had taken 5 minutes, but now that it's going to take a day and a half, they're not interested. So I'm hoping that this little book saves that day and a half for people and gives people the information they need in kind of digestible chunks. Give me, what say you to that?
Yeah, like I said, it's so easy to pick it up, look at the first couple of chapters, and say, okay, I can do this. I can type this in and see what happens. If something comes back that's useful or even just interesting, then, you know, like I said before, it might be a platform onto something more meaningful.
That's my hope. That's my hope. Does anybody have any opinions? If I were more adept and better prepared, I would have had a survey for you folks, because I'm interested. Those of you who might have seen the Slack conversation yesterday, I really am like concerned that maybe Oracle made a mistake when they made DBMS session and auth ID current user instead of auth ID definer. Martin, I bet you have an opinion. Do you?
Yes, I also wrote it half an hour before. I think both the DBMS session and the auto session are kind of low-level interfaces to the kernel itself. And I would not like to have any application touch them directly. Instead, I would like to have them calling the system, which does decide if or if not to enable the trace, like a bigger logging or whatever you call it. So I think there should be something in between. Unfortunately, Oracle does not provide this something in between, so it must come from another developer, which is you or me or whoever. And so we shift the problem away. So Oracle will say it's not their core problem, but we need something in between to give it to their developer, to their application, simply like logging. Not every application should reinvent logging on their own.
Right.
If there would be the God-given perfect logging situation, everyone would use it. And the same I see for DBMS session.
And as you mentioned that, you probably saw that I opened a file called tracepackages.sql. And this is my attempt at basically filling in the gap that you just talked about, and just showing you the definition of the functions that I've created. This is for developers. So I'm assuming your developer name is dev1. And what I'm creating is a package called dev trace that is an auth ID definer, as a trace begin and trace end. Trace end doesn't require any arguments, but trace begin takes whether you want binds, what kind of plans you want. The default is for binds to be false and for the plan stat to be first execution. Statistics level defaults to typical. And then I feel like set module, set action, and set client should all be in one place. And I believe that get service, get module, get action, right? The accessor functions to these setter functions should be in one place, as well as get file name. And so all these things come from different places. Set client comes from DBMS session, set action and set module come from DBMS application info, which I always found weird that they come in different packages. Get file name is, of course, a $diag info query. I'd love you guys to take a look at this as well, because this is all stuff that if there's a mistake in it, I'd like to get it cleared away before really going public with publishing the book. At this point, let me look at my notes here. I think I'm supposed to show a picture of this. So if you're watching this on YouTube, weren't on the live show, but want to be a part of the live shows, visit https://methodr.com/subscribe. And we'll be doing this every Tuesday for the foreseeable future. I want to thank you all for being here, and we'll see you again next week.